Welcome everyone to Big Tent Live Events, the lockdown live online event series brought to you by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme, itself one of the founding stones for the future Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities here in Oxford. My name is Wes Williams and I'm Professor of French Literature and also a Fellow at St Edmund Hall, and I'm also the Knowledge Exchange Champion here at Torch. The Big Tent Live Event series is our way of bringing together once a week researchers and students, performers and practitioners from across the different humanities disciplines. We will explore important subjects and ask challenging questions about areas such as the environment, medical humanities, ethics and AI, the public, the private and the common good, and we will celebrate storytelling and music, performance, poetry and identity. We're bringing you this event programme online to complement social distancing with creative connection. We hope that you're all safe and well during this difficult time, and everyone is welcome in our big tent. So please make yourself metaphorically as well as literally at home this evening as we explore poetry, performance and translation on and off the page, and as we listen to voices from the wings. I'll embarrass both our speakers, who you're really here to listen to, by saying a little more about them, about their work, and why we thought it'd be good to bring them together this evening before we start. But before doing that, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to put forward any questions to our speakers during the event tonight, please pop them in the comments box on YouTube. We encourage you to submit these as early as possible so that we have time to answer as many as possible in the Q&A, which will follow our initial discussion in about 40 minutes or so. Now, on to our excellent speakers tonight. It's an honor to host and to welcome Ulrike Sandig, poet, novelist and performer extraordinaire, and Professor Karen Leeder, scholar, translator and writer, also extraordinaire, based here in Oxford at New College and in the Modern Languages faculty. Born in rural Großenhain in former East Germany, Ulrike Sandig, now an award-winning poet with a whole shelf full of prizes to her name, began life as a kind of guerrilla poet, pasting poems onto lampposts on the streets of Leipzig with friends and handing them out on flyers and free postcards. 2 books of stories and 4 volumes of her poetry have been published since then, and her first novel will appear this autumn. Performance is a key part of Sandig's work. She frequently collaborates with filmmakers, sound artists and musicians, taking poetry to the audiences that poetry doesn't usually reach. And translation, this week's theme, is a vital part of this, not only at the most fundamental level of turning a feeling, an image or an idea into a poem on a page, but also carrying over that impetus, that energy, whether it's of rage or of consolation, into performance, whether it's on the page or on screen, in front of a classical orchestra or in front of an electronic hip hop band. Ulrike has recently undertaken a tour of India and Kashmir, where working with English translations itself enabled further transposition of the poems into other languages, other styles. She also often performs here in the UK, from the Edinburgh Festival and the Hay Festival to the Poetry Festival Stanza. She was, together with our other guest, Karen, and the poetry band Landschaft, due to perform in our actual big tent last month before lockdown. We have here the 2 of them, not instead, but as well as. Karen started her academic life researching the samizdat poetry, art and music scene that existed in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. She's continued her interest in GDR and has published widely on modern German culture, especially for the post-45 and contemporary periods. She's also a prize-winning translator of contemporary German literature, with Volker Braun, Evelyn Schlag and Jost Grünbein all finding their English voice through her work. Her translation of Ulrike Sandig's Thick of It, published by Seagull Books in 2018, won an English Pen Award, along with a whole bunch of other awards around the world. And Ulrike and Karen's collection of newly fashioned Grimm tales appeared in a special limited edition with Her Street Books, also in 2018. Hotly anticipated by the New York Times, their latest collection, due later this summer, is one we get a sneak preview of here. I'm a field full of rapeseed, give cover to deer, and shine like 13 oil paintings laid one on top of the other. We are, in other words, in for a treat. Karen was a Torch Knowledge Exchange Fellow with the South Bank Centre in London way back in 2014 when Knowledge Exchange here in Oxford was just kicking off. And that early work has now blossomed into the ongoing multimedia project that is mediating modern poetry. We'll put links to this and the other work in the chat discussion as we go along. It's a great honor, as I said, to have both Karen and Ulrike here in our metaphorical online tent this afternoon. And I, for one, am excited to see and hear as they explore the ways in which creative forms of translation can come to exemplify the ways in which poetry, that voice from the wings, is itself part of an inclusive political project. So without further delay, I'm delighted to hand over to Ulrike to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Guten Abend, good evening. Hello, everyone. Take the following poem as a little welcome from my side. Mein rechter Platz ist leer. Ich wünsch mir alle Freunde her. Ich wünsch mir, dass ich keinen verliere. Ich wünsch mir, dass keiner nach Haus muss, wenn das Fest noch nicht aus ist. Red Rover, let all my friends come over. Let them all come to stay, not go away. Let not a single one leave before the party is done. Let there be no more forest growing inside us, only round us. Let there be wind in the trees, games in the shade, parties like these, until, like children in the blue of night, we are taken home, tucked up tight. Ich wünsch mir, dass keiner nach Haus muss, wenn das Fest noch nicht aus ist. Ich wünsch mir den Wind in die Äste, die Spiele im Schatten, die rauschenden Feste, bis sich die stoffblaue Nacht um uns legt und uns wie Kinder nach Hause heimträgt.
Oh,
Hi, Karen.
Hello. That was amazing. And it was lovely to hear the English and the German together and to get a taste of you moving between those languages. So thank you very, very much for that. In it, you welcomed everyone into your world of poetry, all your friends. And I wanted to pick up and start our conversation with something Wes said about your beginnings in poetry, where you took poetry out into the streets in a kind of urban intervention. And I wondered how that had influenced your take on poetry now, that desire to reach people. Indeed, when you were touring India recently, unfortunately, I couldn't come with you, and I saw wonderful pictures of you with megaphones in squares. And so can you tell me a little bit about how, how for you poetry is about reaching those people, welcoming them in or going out to meet them?
Well, when I started this street literature project, Augenpost, in English, this would be eye-mail, I suppose. I didn't see it specifically as a literature project. I thought myself as a street artist and student of Indian languages. So, but I didn't see myself as a writer back then, and only through the reactions that I got by these posters, by the people who saw these posters and wanted more of them and asked for them every month when the new edition would come out. Only by these audiences I got through the Augenpost project, I learned how that literature is probably something that addresses to an audience that you don't know. Perhaps that is not your friends and not your family, just an audience that you don't know, but that you hope that its brain works in a similar way as yours. So you hope that you can make yourself understood by someone that you don't even know. probably think that gives me an idea of what literature in general could be. But also, it's of course a thing when you start thinking about literature not through books, but through other means of or other art forms, and that is a point of view from which I still write. I think I still love to work in literary fields in different art forms, not only for the book, but also for the book, of course, and also for the reader. And speaking of that, Karen, it comes to my mind that now, as I had a little bit more time at home that I usually have, in April I had finally time to bring some order into my stuff and look under my piles of books, and who are not as high as Wes's piles that we have seen in the beginning. But I found finally some of these posters, of these Augenpost email posters, which I thought I had long, like years ago, thrown away. So this is what it looks like. That simple, it couldn't be more simple. There was just the logo and the poem and the name, which was a bit of a risky thing because it's of course not allowed to paste your stuff onto every wall you like. But yeah, I wanted to show you this. Isn't that nice? It's still there.
Fantastic. It's a museum piece now, of course.
Yeah, that's because I'm so old now. Yes.
You talked about writing for the page, but also writing, poems that move off the page, and you've collaborated with quite a number of people. We're going to talk about some of those collaborations, but one of the first ones, I think, and one of the lasting and most important ones is with Sebastian Reuter, who's a musician and sound artist.
Yes, Sebastian Reuter calls himself the sound cosmonaut, der Klangkosmonaut. That's him as he is, just as he is. And Sebastian is my partner in life, but also the sound composer that I often work together with for radio pieces. And sometimes we do like small pieces, which are, of course, sometimes we broadcast them with radio stations, but mostly it's for SoundCloud or for Facebook or for my website, like small pieces of like poetry pieces, audible poetry, that's how we call it. That's how we put it. And one of his compositions is Nachricht von der deutschen Sprache. This is the title of my German poem that it's based on in English. In your English translation, it's news about the German language. Is it that? News
That's
about
right.
the German, news from the German language. And the nice thing is when you work with him in the studio, of course it feels like a very humble and small thing that we can't even imagine that someone would like that it has an impact outside of our studio walls, but it does have an impact, and sometimes it makes me like really proud and happy to see what these pieces turn into. And the nice thing about the news from the German language poetry piece is that it got picked up by a Dutch orchestra, the Metropole Orchestra, and they put it into an orchestra, or like transformed it into they orchestrated it basically.
Well, it's not very many poets that get to work with a full-scale orchestra. So let's have a look at that now.
Yes.
der deutschen Sprache. 2026, Anno Domini, Berlin. Wenn es gelingt, bin ich ein Feld voller Raps, verstecke die Rehe und leuchte, wie 13 Ölgemälde übereinander gelegt. Wenn es jetzt schon gelingt, will ich Schaum sein vom Sirup irakischer Datteln, Würfel aus türkischem Honig, syrische Lyrik, eine rund geschliffene geometrische Form wie Kiesen, Wiesenblüten, Bonbon und sprich's aus. Ich bin das Bidjin der schönen, schwarzlockigen, schweren Jungs, die ihre Rhymes austeilen an zärtlichen Bomben. Guckst du? Keiner fliegt hier in die Luft außer den Tauben. Wenn es nicht gelingt, will ich meine Sprache vergessen. Je suis ein Feld voller Monokultur, ersticke die Schlehen und drehe mich weg. Je suis nicht mehr mein eigen Heimatland. Aber wenn es gelingt, werden wir, ihr alle und ich, zeitgleich ein Kinderlied reimen, wie aus einem einzigen Mund voller Raps. Wir werden ein fließender Leib sein auf weißem Papier. Wir werden leicht sein und schwer, vor allem aber werden wir sein.
That was great. Thank you for that. Monoculture, against monoculture, and what a more brilliant way than to do that. That's brilliant.
Yes, because because of course it's not I don't want to like show off, oh no, I worked with a orchestra, but the nice thing about collaborations like that is that you get the chance to be heard with your ideas about society, and that you kind of contribute to an ongoing struggle to change, to make the world a better place. I can't find better words in English to put it, but I hope, I mean, you know what I mean. It's not just the art. It's a means of communication, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. You remember you telling me once when we were performing that some poems, it takes you a long time before you know how they can be performed, and you don't perform them. And then years later, you suddenly understand how they will come, almost like they've got a kind of third dimension implicit in them, but you've got to find it.
Yes.
And is it your collaborators who help you find it, or is it a process within you develops and allows it to come into being?
Well, I think it's more a process within me, because I wouldn't show poems that I don't have an idea of their audibility yet to collaborators such as Sebastian or Grigory, whom we will talk about later on. I think it's also the idea that some poems are not meant to be audible at all. Or if audible at all, then with your inner voice, I guess. So sometimes there is a poem that for instance, the first poem in my latest volume, it looks very audible when you, it reads very audible because it deals with Latin song that is very well known in Germany for political reasons. This Dona nobis pacem, you know that song, but it took me years until I finally, like last year, I think, found a way to perform this properly, because it felt like people should hear this song with which I changed a little bit in my poem, with their inner voice. But last year, suddenly I found myself on a festival in southern Germany, and it was a very light summer atmosphere, and suddenly I changed my set list in my reading, and started to perform this poem to the audience and made them sing along with me, which was a surprise for myself and for them as well. But sometimes sometimes these poems, like, they take independent ways from what you actually thought them to be. Yeah.
How scary for your audience. They'll be very worried now coming to your concerts.
Yeah, they won't dare going to my readings again, ever. Yeah, but what I always ask myself, what I wonder, is how poems like die Nachricht von der deutschen Sprache, the news from the German language, and German poems in your English translation in general, how are they received by the English audience, by your readership? How does it make a difference for English readers when you show them a poem and you say, okay, that's not my own poem, that's a poem by, for instance, Ulrike Almut Sandig or Durst Grün, when you have translated quite a range of German poets like Graue Schrott, Durst Grün, Mein Volker Braun. And does it make a difference to them, and especially specifically when it's a poem that deals with language, such as the last one?
Well, I suppose you're speaking to a kind of self-selecting audience in some ways. I interviewed a poet not very long ago, Michael Krüger, and he told this brilliant anecdote about how there's always 1,376 people in any country that read poetry. And that doesn't matter if it's a tiny country or a huge country. Those 1,370 people you're talking to. And so I think it's people that are ready to have their language stretched and be open to something that is outside their language, but not beyond it. And I think, and your poetry does that. I mean, I think that's what fascinates me in it, in that I don't think it exists in the English language. And why I wanted to translate it was because I wanted to, create, shove aside things and make a place for it in English, because it seemed to me it wasn't a voice that was in English. And I think, I've had, we both had very good reception to that. And I think that's what people recognize, that something new, a voice from the wings, a voice from outside our language is coming in and claiming, staking its own place in the language and changing the language because of it. That reminds me, you mentioned Grigory earlier, and that's Grigory Semenchuk, who works in your poetry band Landschaft.
That's him, yes, that is
him here. And he's Ukrainian, and the band name Landschaft, in a sense, is programmatic, isn't it, of the kind of project of the poetry band. And
yes, it is.
It was interacting. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, Grigory Semenchuk, he is not only a poet, but also a musician. And he's into hip hop a lot, but his roots are in punk and punk music. I met him in 2015. I know he's watching, so I'm just saying, hi, greets. And we started as a sort of blind date in Kiev. In Kiev, there is a book fair which is very young. In Arsenal, in a special place in a special place in Kiev, and we were put together by the Goethe Institute actually as a blind date for one poetry performance improvisation actually, or concept improv. So and we met literally 1 hour before going on stage, but we had exchanged some music and poetry in Ukrainian and English translation before. So, but the thing is, when we went on stage together, sometimes I like improvisation a lot, but I mostly improv is great for just the show, and then that's it, and you can never hold on to it because it really lives in the moment. But this time it was a little bit different because we were ourselves, and as well as the public, a little bit blown away of what actually happened on stage, because it wasn't just only the two of us. There was something that was we could connect so easily together that we felt like we do something really together that goes beyond improv. And so since then we've been making music based on poetry together. And you mentioned the programmatic title name Landschaft, because when I found this name when I was in another year in Kiev again to record some poems with him, with his music, and to develop in the studio some new poetry songs with him. And in the middle of one poem, I listened to his Ukrainian rapped version of my poem, and I listened, and I found myself recognizing a couple of words, because Ukraine has, of course, has a strong influence by the Russian language, but also is Ukraine, the language itself is influenced by Polish and also by the German language. And Landschaft is a Ukrainian word, so it's it derives from German, but it's a Ukrainian word. In English, it's landscape. So and I thought, okay, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to think of poetry together with grits as something that has a lot to do with where we're from, but that is freer than our nations are allowed to be. So I want to be freer than the nation I'm accidentally born in. And and we found that, and so that's why we kind of stick to that name. Even our album is called Landschaft, so we need to find a new one for the next album, I think, because we're planning a next EP for the next year. So but
well, I think sort of moving beyond the nation you're accidentally born into is a wonderful utopian project, especially for us here in these Brexit times.
Oh yeah.
We're going to hear a clip and see a poem that you've done in just a second. But in this poem, you also bring in a third element, don't you? Which is a line from an English poem. And so actually, it really is an amalgam of nationalities and voices.
Yes, the next poem or poetry song, however you want to put it, we don't really care about the names of what we do. The next piece, basically in die Natur, into nature, is based on 3 lines of Emma McGordon, of a poem by Emma McGordon, because we were supposed to perform with her in Lancaster for the Lancaster Literature Lit Festival, Lancaster I think it's called, last year in March in 2019. But since the process of Brexit has been like on the way, has been going on. It's very hard for non-EU, as you all know, I suppose it's very hard for non-EU residents to get a visa. So in the end, Grigory wasn't allowed to come to perform with me in Lancaster. So, but what we would, so he stayed in Lviv, where he lives in Western Ukraine, but I flew over to Lancaster and performed this poem alone with him. But knowing that he wouldn't be there, we had already prepared something that I could do myself. And this is, and Emma McGordon was there as well. So, and as a tribute to our collaboration with her and to her great verses and to the joy of being with her on stage, we made this piece based on her lines. And I took her, what I did is I took her lines, her last 3 lines, which are very short, put them into one line and made an anagram out of that, a German anagram. And this anagram sort of mirrors her reflections by chance, I guess, by the glory of language itself. It mirrors her reflections of her own poem, because in her poem she reflects her upbringing in a certain area in England, and which is an area close to the coast, and this poem also deals with coasts and with oceans and what the climate change does to these coasts. Yeah.
Let's hear it.
Yes.
Is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. And I am true lies.
The tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. In der Heimat tollten Rettungshunde als Alge. Oh, ein Ei! Hatte es unterm Hut getragen. Leer in den Lilien oder Lidos, liegende, rinnende Gottesstatue. Holla, reit an! Im Ultragrün der Auen toasten Satelliten, Goldhelme. Hinein in die Natur. Hinein in die Natur. The tongue is a needle, and I am true north, telling lies. The tongue is a needle, oh,
Is a needle.
die Tiere heulten, Moos, lallten, Ex. Hat uns hier einer angelogen? Lea, du trottest dahin mit ellenlangen, teuren Automaten. Heilst Heide, grillst die Juden. Und hinterher ausgeatmete Kiwi-Insel-Atolle. Not. Du, mandeläugige Lea, nennst es Nitrithalle. Tod, ihr Norden, heiter Tod. Hüll die Gaumensegel in Atlantis. Es ist so. and I am true north, telling lies. Exalt
The tongue is a needle,
and I am true north, telling lies.
Yeah. Karen, I wonder if you can tell the audience a bit about how you managed to translate the anagram sort of back into English.
Well, yes, the eagle-eyed bilingual watchers, the viewers, will have noticed that the English isn't a direct translation of the German, because I took this as an opportunity to riff in the same way that Ulrike had, by taking the exact letters of the line and then reproducing those exact letters, no more, no less, in every line, and trying to translate not so much the words, but a kind of mood.
Yes.
And the only thing that I knew I had to get in there was the Gili Isles, which are Indonesian atoll, which is sinking, where turtles lay their eggs. And so that was my only fixed point. And actually, the further away I went from the poem, the more I came back to it. So I hope it is there. But it did take, I think I sent you about 10 versions, but actually I looked back about 25. There's a host of different anagram poems it spawned. We're racing through time, and I want to make sure that we do cover everything that people have asked us to talk about. And so I want to talk quickly about also another kind of source that you used, which is the Grimm's fairy tales, which are best known to us in Britain through Disney. But I think anybody coming to your modern contemporary reanimations of them would not recognize much from Disney, not only because it's not so well known in this country, but also because you play on the title Grimm, which also means rage in German. And I wondered if you've also working with on this Grimm cycle also, I had said the word reanimation, but you've also literally worked with animators on it and taken your sort of treatment of a literary heritage into a new realm, in that these poems have been animated by Beate Kunath Eléonore Roedel, including the English. Now, there's a lot we could talk about there, but perhaps we could focus first of all on why, just before and I should say they've been set to music by Landschaft again. Let's have a quick look at that wonderful image of the Landschaft cover. You've got a sort of grim kind of...
It's a very crazy sort of grim, I assume.
But just before we listen to and see one of those tracks, can you talk a little bit about what attracted you to going back to these old ancient stories in order to sing about contemporary world?
Yes. It started with a love for these collection of Grimm fairy tales, which I was quite afraid of when I was a kid because of their cruelness and their strangeness of language. They are not the ones. Everyone who has ever read the like more than the 5 famous simplified fairy tales that we all know, everyone who has had a closer look on that will easily see that these that they have a very special language which is hard to read even in German, and they have a complicated history of editions which were changed first by the brothers themselves, and then later on by parents who were afraid that these fairy tales could frighten their children. So it's a very complicated story, and I was fascinated by that. That's how it started. But and I wanted to work on them. But when I started working on them, the news about the sinking ships and the Mediterranean Sea started to spread, and I was following on that I had been following on that for some years already, but suddenly in 2014, I think, it was all it was like it was like the journalists had finally understood that there has to be written about this, because it's been going on for such a long time already, the dying. And I was totally, I could not concentrate on anything else, because I was so full of fury and grim indeed. And I found myself not having the words to express what I think, to express my feelings and my not having the language for some way, and this is something which and in this period, these Grimm fairy tales kind of provided me with words that I didn't have before, and with images to express my fury, my grim. So what I basically did in the end was laying a second layer, a second contemporary layer of thoughts and images of cruelness on the like a transparent foil on these fairy tales, and that's how the cycle developed, basically.
Fantastic. Let's hear one of them now.
Alte Wölfin, die hatte 7 Welpen, die schnürten ihr nach durchs Dickicht Europas. Über den 16 gelben Pupillen, die wechselnden Kronen der Eichen und Leuchtraketen der nackten Verrückten ohne Verstand. Die lodernden Städte erschwerten die Nachtsicht am Anfang, am Ende und unter den leisesten Wallen. Blindgänger, rasende Landschaft, Leichen im Laub. Es waren 7 Welpen. Die wurden zu Rüden, die schnürten durch Weiden und Forste. Die Pfoten immer im Abdruck dessen, der vor ihnen lief. Die nackten, Verrückten bleckten die Zähne, sie meinten, der Wolf gehe um. Bös und allein. Der Wolf gehe um. Bös und allein. Es waren 7 Wölfe. Die kannten kein einziges Märchen und hätten es auch nicht verstanden. Es waren 7 Wölfe. Die kannten kein einziges Märchen und hätten es auch nicht verstanden. Die kannten kein einziges Märchen und hätten es auch nicht verstanden. Die kannten kein einziges Märchen und hätten es auch nicht verstanden. Die kannten kein einziges Märchen und hätten es auch nicht verstanden.
That was great, and you know, I'm enjoying this so much that we could go on for hours, but I'm noticing the time and I don't want to tax our viewers too much. I hope it means that Torch will invite us back to the Big Tent next year to really perform. And so I want to cut to
Take the hint.
I want to cut to a kind of final further step in collaborative poetry making that you've made recently with the wonderful filmmaker Sasha Conrad, who we've got a picture of again.
Yes, Sasha.
And we might introduce the most recent kind of collaboration you've done, which is, again, takes a text from the German canon, but this time the great 18th century poet Friedrich Hölderlin. But you're working with a filmmaker and have moved beyond animation now to film. And what is more, in a very recent, in fact, a couple of days ago, we saw a new version that was in English as well. We're going to cut out and sort of finish with this, and we might talk about it a little bit in the Q&A, but can you give us just a little insight into what you were hoping to do? This was presumably a commission for the 250th anniversary of Hölderlin's death this year.
Yes, specifically this was a commission to the Hölderlin Tower in Tübingen, where Hölderlin has spent the last 3 decades of his life in someone else's house, not really leading an independent life. Like he was like a humble person living in someone else's house in the last 3 decades of his life, and now it's a beautiful museum, and they wanted to open up a new permanent exhibition, and asked me to just recite a poem, a Hölderlin poem, and then put it into a poetry film. And I said, no, I won't just recite it, because I find Hölderlin truly difficult to recite and to read and to understand, because he had this very special aesthetics, which is, how to put it, it's always like as he looks at the world from the outside. That was also part of his life. He was never part of something, despite his numerous tries to be part of a political or a poetic movement. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do something, but just let me try my own stuff and let me write something in between the Hölderlin lines. So what I did was I combed my own lines in between his lines. So I reworked his poem and found myself to feel like I'm inviting Hölderlin to finally be a part of a scene, be a part of a scene that is politically aware, that takes part takes part in society, which is, I think, something that he would have liked. I hope so. But yeah, and then I gave this to Sasha along with some ideas of like images, what I wanted to do with him, and we made this movie, which I think also has a very Hölderlin-esque aesthetics, but seen from the sci-fi point of
view.
Seen
from outer space. Yes, let's watch it.
After
Friedrich Hölderlin has went on holidays to walk out and see the field.
he stood behind the house, so we stand here and there.
From a night of heat, the cooling lightning fell.
Across this heath too, fairy lights, foreign fields.
And the stream returns once more between its banks.
And I too fall back into bed in a single stroke.
And with the heavens delighting rain,
I still drip when I'm fast asleep again.
in quiet sunlight stands the grove of trees.
Clearly audible, the drying of things in us.
Like this they stand in favorable water.
As we stand, forgetting how things bleed away.
All present with a light on rays.
Forgetfulness teaches us to be the idiots we are.
For when in certain seasons of the year nature seems to sleep,
She does not really sleep, but beats.
the poet's face is also sorrow.
Go on and blub. Fist at our throat, as one beats sheep at shearing time.
For even when she rests she senses what will be.
As one rests, when one forgets, as soon as it's done.
But now the day breaks. Waiting I saw it come.
But now it makes me mad.
For she herself, who is older than the oldest sheep,
Older than the shearing, older even than the shearing blade.
nature now has woken with the sound of arms.
Our light strings, stretched across the night, are all the same to her.
By established law, as in former times, born from holy chaos,
She shares patterns and logical series, cuts us off in one go.
creator of all things, once more, you ask where she is?
Ask instead, can you bear her, blow after blow? Say, shining sheep, shining sheep, shining sheep, Friedrich. And now, go to sleep.
And this is also thanks to your translation, Karen. I hope you recognize your words.
I do. But look, this has been such fun. But I think it's time. Let's turn to Wes now and bring him back in to join us.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hey.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We've been on quite a journey there. And actually, there's a host of questions, as you might imagine, that I'm trying to put together into an order that would make sense. And I wonder actually if we might start right where you finished, where Ulrike, you asked Karen whether she recognized herself there. And a number of people have asked the question, but in reverse, actually, which is, do you, Ulrike, recognize yourself in Karen's English voice? But I might ask the question of both of you, in other words. Do you recognize each other's voices?
Yeah, I just thought about that in the very beginning when I recited this poem in which I invite my friends, and I recited that in English and German. And whenever I do that, I feel like the English version is my own poem and as well Karen's own poem. So it feels like the way Karen would pronounce it is somehow in the way that I recite it as well. So it feels like a hybrid between the two of us, I'd say. And I noticed that the more, Karen, the more you go away from my original version, the closer you get to what I want to do, basically. Yeah, perhaps like in the anagram we had before.
Well, that's nice. I mean, I think it's brilliant to work with a poet who's very generous in that sense, because I don't think all poets are, because you have to trust someone with your voice, and they might not want you disappearing down different alleyways and you fetch up at the same place. But it raises a question about, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and it raises a question about what you think you're doing when you're translating, and I know Ulrike also translates. I mean, I hope I'm not translating the different poets I translate into my voice necessarily. There's a transparent translation, but I don't want them to all end up as Karen. That would be just awful.
No, yeah. that was also not what I really meant. It's just like it shines through.
That's it. It kind of strains through your experience, doesn't it? And inevitably there'll be words that mean something to you, and so you're there always. But I do think of the translator a bit as a chameleon, changing colour, changing voice, depending on who they're working with.
You also mentioned anagrams in there, and again, another, I thought, really interesting question that came in, which is, how does the formal constraint of, let's say, an anagram relate to the apparently free form of the music, of the poem, of the performance? What's that sort of dialectic, if you like, or maybe it's not a dialectic? What's the relation between those two?
It's hard to say, because it depends on the project and on what was first, the music or the poem or the film or the whatever. But when we get back to the anagram, I found that I needed to loosen the anagrammatic structure when I put it into music, with such simple means as adding a chorus, the chorus, like as treating Emma McGordon's initial lines as a chorus, which I then sang again in the middle and then in the end. But apart from that, I try to stick to the structure somehow, but and still, it's both. It's sticking to the structure and also trying not to see the structure anymore, because it's so embodied in the piece already, that you don't need to think about the structure anymore and that feels very free in the end.
There's a huge freedom when you have a tiny compass, actually.
Yes.
Around you, then triggers all kinds of new directions, and it gives you an enormous movement. Well, at least it does to me. So I quite enjoy. When I first looked at that poem, I thought, of course I can't translate it. Of course I can. But actually, there are very few things you really can't translate, as long as you're working with a poet who allows you that kind of freedom as well.
Okay, that's interesting, because one of the questions was, the untranslatable question, or how do you translate a word that has multiple meanings, say in one language, but doesn't seem to have the same multiple meanings in another? I mean, grim is an example. Grim means something quite different in English than rage. And so what do you do with that? Do you what do you do with that multiplicity across languages?
That's a very good question. I think every translator comes up against that. And I think there are places. I'm trying to translate a poem at the moment by a different poet, Brothers Grimm, where he uses three words, morn, wohn, and mond, which all sound very similar in German, but living room, Wohnzimmer, living room, poppy and moon in English, and he interplays. I don't think I can do it. I've got to find three different words completely to make a poem at all. And it reminds me of, we did a poem together, Ulrike and I, in the new collection, which in German is called Pizzakatze, which is the phrase you use when you're doing beatbox in German. And I started translating it and thinking, well, this is very fine. And then I realized, of course, that's not what you say for beatbox in English. And so there's a different poem. There's a different cat, as it happened, not a pizza cat, but a cat in a kit and boots and so on. And there's a different story in the English poem. So I think that if you're given that freedom, you can create a kind of essence, if not the words. You can sort of translate a feeling, translate a mood, translate an idea or an image.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering then if that folds back into your own practice, Ulrike. What is, having been translated, change your understanding of what you're doing as a poet?
Oh, a lot. Just yesterday, I had a Skype chat with Karen, in which I felt the need to admit to her that I actually understood my own Hölderlin poem better through her translation. So, and that's why you know, the film that we have just seen wasn't English in the first place. It was, I recorded the audios in German, and also the automatic voice was in German. So the Hölderlin, or the automatic voice of Hölderlin was in German, but the way I spoke it in my original version was quite different from the way I spoke it now in English, because I felt I had understood not only what I'm saying, but also how it feels what I'm saying, and also the impact of what I'm saying. I felt that more through Karen's translation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so then in a sense that's already, it's funny, this often happens that you're answering questions that are coming in as we go, and somebody's asking about whether a text that's translated through different languages or through different media, in a sense, gains incrementally through that process. And I think you're saying yes, Ulrike, and not only does it gain incrementally, but also you go back to the origin and think again about what it was at the beginning. Is that right?
Well, I'd say I'd go further than that, perhaps. I'd say when you translate a poem into another art form, as is a poetry film or whatever, an installation in urban space or whatever, it becomes something else. Mm-hmm. Without losing its being a poem. It stays a poem, but in the same time, it's something else. And this is what I definitely love about poetry, that it has so many, that it stretches out to other art forms way more than a novel or prose could ever do.
I think that's so interesting that you said that about not understanding, or because I didn't understand that poem when I translated it. The translation was part of understanding it, and it reminded me, that same interview I talked about earlier was also with Paul Muldoon, who was kind of mischievous and said that he wondered if every poem wasn't a translation of a sort of poem, and so a translation might actually get closer to that sort of first impulse without really knowing. It is fanciful, but also kind of interesting, I think, that maybe, you know, I tapped into something that was the same thing that inspired you, way. And then again with the film, Sasha perhaps recognized something, because there, you know, there's no in your in your poem, but yet they're so right. That alienation has sort of found a different image.
Well, I'm a little bit suspicious whenever I hear the word "or," because it goes back to this 19th century. I don't know, when thinking of a perfect source of language. Of it even goes back to the strange idea of Indo-Germanic languages, and like in former time there was the perfect world, and now we are all have all that comes out of that is degenerated monsters. It's like I find that very pessimistic and not very humanistic in a way, but yeah, that's
there's a
Yeah.
positive way of maybe thinking about going back to something, which again, one of the questions says that your work exposes to some degree the archaic roots of modern poetry. So incorporating media, song and dance, in a sense, before the page, before, if you like, the shining sheep became vellum and then became something else and so on and so forth. Would you recognize yourself in that perspective?
Sort of yes. It's I find my way to treat poetry as something off the page. I find that traditional in the sense of poetry being something that was vital long before there were letters and print and written language. So poetry was, of course, sung before it was written down, and so whenever someone tells me that I'm so 21st century Berlin-esque in my art form, I find myself a little bit misunderstood, because this is what I want to do is refer. I see myself in a long line of tradition, which is not only in books, of course. Yeah.
I think we've got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and some of them are very sort of practical questions, if you like, which are, how do we get to a world where translation is more respected, where even poets and aspiring poets and poetry translators, I mean, you guys are in there. What advice do you have to aspiring poets or poetry translators about how to find their voice in the world, but also how to find publics and so on, if any?
Oh, that's hard. That's hard. That's a tricky question, because things change so quickly, and when I started, I think I felt the scene very different from as it is now. But I think I still think it's important. It's important to read your colleagues. Yeah, just do read your colleagues. Don't stop reading at the middle of the 20th century, and try to see what's actually being written as something that is part of a tradition, as well as reinventing itself the whole time. But I don't know about but it's more the practical, technical aspect of this question is hard, because of course it's hard to be paid for your work. All I can say is respect the works of others as much as you respect your own works, and don't stick only to the page in terms of literary magazines, it's important to publish there, but it's also important to know how TikTok and Instagram works, or whatever you like. I like to follow my sympathies when I'm interested in a certain software. Then I want to use that software for my art form as well as for my private communication. I try not to think, oh, okay, this is only for art and this is for private life, because all of this belongs together.
And Karen is a poetry translator as well.
Well, I was going to say, I'm just going to be very pragmatic, as I am. We have poetry and the pragmatism. Read again, read back, read contemporaries, read everything, read multiple languages. But I think people tend to be very gloomy about the position of poets and translators now. But actually, one of the things about social media is there's a huge platform out there of magazines, online magazines, but also real small magazines. And so and of course you can publish yourself. So you can actually get your voice out there in a way that a couple of decades you couldn't. And then I would say go and hear people, meet people and talk to people. It's a great world of serendipity, I think, that world. And as you say, your blind date with Grigory has led to this sort of language. And I think that's happened to me before. Chance encounters have led to all kinds of things. I think read so that you're ready, and then put yourself out there.
Okay, last question. Chance encounters. How did you guys meet? How did you start?
Oh, it's a long time ago. What was the start of it? I don't know, Karen. Can you tell?
I do know, actually. I was asked by somebody in Australia to curate a magazine of contemporary, a subsection of contemporary, New Zealand. I'm so embarrassed, New Zealand. They were the guest country at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and so they were doing a subsection of a magazine of contemporary German poetry, and I was asked to curate that. And I nearly said no because I was overwhelmed with work. And then I just started reading small magazines and anthologies, and finding the poets that really spoke to me. And I picked 6 poets, I think, and Ulrike was the first one. Ulrike had to be there because just as soon as I read her, I knew that I wanted to translate her, and I knew that I wanted to find out what was going on in her poems. I wanted to know what made them tick, and that's where it started, actually. And so there was a little anthology, and then I wrote to her and said, "Can I translate these?"
Yeah.
And do you remember that moment, at least, Ulrike?
Yeah, I remember the email. I remember the email, yes, and the sports magazine, of course, which is somewhere there. And yes, and I remember that I had worked with English translators before, with one American translator living in Leipzig in Germany, Bradley Schmidt, and then various different translators for certain projects, and that. And I had always longed for someone who could give me company through the years, through the coming years, and it turned out that we gave each other good company, Karen.
Definitely.
Okay, well, perhaps on that note, we should bring things to a close. I'd like to thank both of you, our brilliant speakers, Karen and Ulrike, for a wonderful session this evening. And a big thank you to our viewers at home for watching and for your many comments and questions. And so for one last time, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Ulrike.
Thank you, Wes.
Thank you, Wes, and thank you, Torch.
You've all given your time, everyone here, your thoughts, your questions, and your engagement as we come together online. This series would not be possible without the support, as Karen said, of many people in the Torch team, as it were, backstage. And we'd like to thank them all too. Please do come back next week at the same time for a session on the world after COVID, where there'll be a conversation between Professor Peter Frankopan, director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research, and of course a historian who's written about the Silk Road, amongst many other things, and Professor Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. But for now, thank you again for coming. Stay safe, stay well, and goodbye for now.